I am Monica Hoyer. I'm from Influence, a digital marketing platform, marketing automation in particular. We also have an agency side of the business that specializes in digital marketing for some clients. And I have here with me today Marie Wiese from Marketing CoPilot. Marie, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you're going to be much better at it than I am. So turn the mic over to you and just flag me down if you need anything from me.
All right. Thanks so much, Monica. Thanks for everybody who's joining us today. I am actually from the Greater Toronto area in Toronto, Canada, but today I'm joining you from Sacramento, California, which I'm pretty excited to be in California today, given that we're having, I think, another snowstorm up in Toronto. So it's feeling pretty good seeing the sunny spring down here in California. I am the president of Marketing CoPilot, and we help companies get their sales process mapped to the web so that companies can turn leads and names on an email list into sales qualified leads. And there's a lot of things that go into doing that. This is a process that I've been working on for about 15 years now. What you're going to see today is our proprietary methodology about how we do a customer journey map and map the customer journey. I've been in the tech sector for 30 years. I currently work with companies like Influence, particularly in the Dynamics channel and the Microsoft channel, as people are now trying to tackle marketing automation as well as CRM. And what I'm finding in the channel right now is that there's a lot of siloed approaches to sales and marketing, and there shouldn't be, and they can't be anymore. So what I want to jump into as we lead off with this particular masterclass is everybody today needs to map their buyer personas. Everybody needs a buyer journey map, because if they can't do that, they won't be able to align sales and marketing, and then they won't be able to align their technology products. So this is why I'm so excited to teach this course. I teach a number of other courses in the digital space around value proposition design, building a high performing marketing sales funnel for your business using your website in particular. And there's a number of other courses that we teach, but this is by far my favorite course. I love this course, and I like this course because it just will make a marketer's or even a salesperson's life so much easier when we do the work to do this. So Monica, is it okay with you if I just dig right in and get going?
Let's get started. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
People are still trickling in, but they can catch up through the recording.
Okay, fantastic. So here's what you're going to learn today. We're going to, as I've already kicked it off, we're going to understand the importance of developing buyer personas and why they're needed to deliver a better journey that helps you and your company make money. And, there's been a lot of talk in the last year about what are the new, there's always in January, here's what marketers should be looking forward to, or here's what salespeople should be looking forward to in the new year. You heard a lot of talk about account-based marketing last year. You probably heard a lot of talk about personalization last year. None of those things can happen without mapping your buyer personas and doing a buyer journey map for your business. They just can't, because you have to be really rock solid on who you're targeting and why. So we think this helps you make money. So if you have to make a pitch to your senior management team to say, we need to do buyer personas, we need to train people on how to do this, the pitch is simply this: if we do it, it's going to help us make more money, because you're going to see how we can really start to use this to understand our leads, what they need to do to make an informed decision, and whether we're turning email addresses into sales qualified leads. And that's what everybody wants in their business. So we're going to really dig in today into the content, in particular, the content that you need in order to make for your buyer to make an educated buying decision. And the whole goal of this, as we've seen in the last 24 months, we don't often have the luxury these days of having our sales rep speak to somebody, especially in the B2B space. B2C has been a little bit different. Business to consumers is still different, but I think the best consumer experiences are when there are a blend of digital customer service and real customer service. And in the business to business space, we've spent a lot of years relying on our sales team to go explain a product or service to someone, and buyers just don't have the patience for that anymore. So this is really the primary objective: to uncover the content that a buyer needs to make an educated buying decision. All right, so we're going to define buyer personas, but before we do that, we have a couple of poll questions. So I'm going to rely on my good friend Krista to pop up our first poll question right now, because we'd love to know, do you currently use buyer personas to develop your website content? So if you can just take a minute and
The
Oh, this is
answers are
fantastic.
rolling in, Marie.
They are. This is fantastic. I love interaction. I love it when people get on side. Okay. Okay, fantastic. Krista, I think we can end that poll. I'm going to go to the next slide. Let me see. I think my screen got frozen there, Krista, with the poll being up. So I don't know if the poll has to come down so that I can get to the next slide.
All right, there are the, let's see if we can close that. Okay, let's see if that worked.
All right, it did. Thank you. So here's a definition of a buyer persona. And, you know, I get asked a lot about definitions and things. So I think it's really important that we just do a quick level set about what the actual definition of a buyer persona. It's insights that guide a prospective customer's thought process and decision-making in the purchase of a high consideration product. So I don't know exactly who's on the call today with respect to business to consumer. But, you know, even purchasing something, it doesn't necessarily need to be expensive, but it has to be complex in understanding all the moving parts. And that's what we mean by a high consideration product. Going online and buying a pair of Nike tennis shoes is probably not high consideration. You probably know you need tennis shoes, and then you go online to figure out where are all the different places that sell tennis shoes. What do you want? High consideration, though, is where there really is a lot of digging that has to happen to understand the implications of a product or a service to somebody's business objectives, particularly in business to business, but also in high-end consumer items, there's a high consideration that goes on. And that buyer is going through a number of different things in their head, and there are insights they're looking for to help guide the decision-making. So that's really what the definition of a buyer persona is. So quick worksheet, we're going to ask you to do some work. And I know this is going to seem like a simple exercise, but I'm always surprised at how many people get stumped when we do this exercise. I want you to fill in the blank to this question. People pay us to fill in the blank, and it can't be more than, 5 to 7 words. People pay us to do what? Fill that blank in for me right now.
And folks, you should feel free to throw it in the chat too, if you are willing to share that information with the rest of the attendees, and we can talk about some of our evolve their e-commerce strategy. Great. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, please fill in. And I love it when people are succinct because we're looking for clarity. Okay, so you really want to take a minute if you're going to do some notes today or you're working out some stuff, and we're going to give you a buyer persona workbook at the end and a couple other little goodies. But do write this down and think about this, because if, first of all, you have a hard time answering this question, or secondly, everybody in the company isn't answering it the same way, you're going to have a hard time with your buyer personas. So that's kind of the first challenge. And I think it's an easy challenge to overcome. And I like to do that by asking people very simply, what do you think people pay us to do? Okay, so that leads us to really being clear on who's the economic buyer of your products or services. And this is the person who makes the final decision to purchase and somebody who authorizes the writing of a check. Now, I know that in our sales process, there could be influencers, there could be people doing the research. It could be, a manager of engineering who's doing the research to figure out what type of new engineering tools or products that they should be purchasing. But at the end of the day, we want to, at the highest level content, understand who the economic buyer is and how they're viewing that economic purchase and that buying decision. So we really do want to start first and foremost with the person who authorizes writing a check. And it's as simple as that. I used to have a boss who used to say to me when I was back in software sales in financial services market, he used to say, who is it who's writing the check? Just write the check. And that was always the person that we had to really figure out what their buying journey was going to look like. Who were they going to bring in to do research? Who were the influencers in the sale? But it was always, who is it who writes the check? So some examples for you might be president of a small business, or, the person who is the owner operator of a small business. It might be the CFO, the chief financial officer. It could be the controller in the organization. Other examples, it could be, office admin, that they really are the one who makes a purchasing decision for office cleaning, as an example. And that is kind of a complex, high consideration product. You have to take a whole bunch of factors into consideration there. Could be your IT manager if you're selling technology, or it could be the chief information officer who, really is setting the strategy, and you have to sell them on the strategy first before you can sell them on the solution. So those are the types of examples we're looking for. So I'm going to use a quick example here. This is a woman named Judy Beck. She's a fictitious person. She doesn't exist, but she's a fictitious person who's an operations manager at Wholesale Plus Limited. Personal information about her: she's 35 to 44, married with 2 children, university degree, loves to ski, focused on teamwork. And the company itself is a wholesale manufacturing company, annual revenue of 100 million, sales in North America. She personally reports to the general manager. This is what we would have typically in years past used in marketing to try to figure out how we're going to market to a person like Judy. And we would have used these demographics information. This is how we would have, summed it up. And so, the person or the questions I want to ask you today about Judy is, what does this tell us about how Judy makes a buying decision? What would motivate Judy to go look for a new solution within her business? Does that tell us anything about that? What does Judy like or dislike about the current solution that she has if she was going to buy something for this company? And what does she like or dislike about what she's done in the past? So what problems was Judy trying to overcome? So my point about demographics is it doesn't tell us a whole lot about the buyer journey. It basically just tells us about somebody like Judy that we might want to market to. But there could be somebody who buys and behaves exactly like Judy, who's a 65-year-old manager of operations, who's male, who's been doing it forever. My point is demographics tell us very little. Let's pretend for a second, and I want to use this chart to emphasize this. Let's pretend for a second that we're selling tech services into a company. And if we're selling tech services into a company and you're selling them to an organization that's got 25 to 50 employees or users, they probably don't have a director of IT. They probably don't have a CIO. And they probably just have an IT manager who's trying to manage things. So what we know about the problem he's trying to solve is that they lack IT knowledge, because when you're trying to manage a whole bunch of stuff, you can't do a deep dive on things. So as we're trying to understand what their problems are and how they're going to purchase something, if the IT manager is the purchaser, we want to list things that are going on with that IT manager. They're going to be wearing multiple hats. They're going to be looking for support and strategic guidance. They're going to be looking for a level of IT their level of IT understanding is going to be low. So now you can start to get in your head and paint a picture of the type of content that this person's going to need in order to make an educated buying decision. Let's just say that we've got a phase 2 type of company, and this would be a second type of persona, where it's a slightly larger company and there is a director of IT, but there isn't necessarily somebody who's setting IT strategy. And they might start to use in-house resources for day-to-day activities, but they need support with procurement, deployment, support issues. And now if we go to look at a larger buyer persona and what we would call, buyer persona 3, they're the type of people who want to understand the impact of IT on the business. They probably have a CIO. They want IT leadership. So you understand now that the types of content you are going to serve up to each one of these personas is going to be incredibly different, because the IT manager wants to know what's the latest and greatest in cybersecurity. The CIO probably already has a cybersecurity strategy in place, but they're trying to figure out, how do I get ahead of the competition and ensure that my customers feel really confident based on the cybersecurity strategy that we've chosen. So you see, there's a very different set of content, and there's a very different set of requirements, and there's a very different set of pain points that each one of these personas would be using. So I want to share a story with you because I think storytelling is good, and I want to share a case study with you. This was a client of ours up in Northern Ontario, and they had a website that just was a mess when we first started working with them. It listed every single product and service they possibly could sell in the Microsoft channel. And it was really unclear who their buyer persona was. So we went through an exercise with them where we worked on their value proposition, and then we mapped their buyer persona to the website. And in doing so, we learned about a number of different things, that this company sells regionally. They don't really sell outside the region because they specialize in helping people in the mining sector, which is a big part of Northern Ontario. And so, they needed to really focus on Northern Ontario as an anchor for their buyer persona. We established their value proposition about translating Microsoft solutions into business operations success, is because most of their buyer personas were really struggling with operations. So I just want to show you the new homepage of the website that we developed for them and that we tested. And so their persona is the owner of a small business. And here's their priority: replacing a system that no longer meets their business needs. And they were having the customers that they work with, particularly in the mining sector, and the natural resources and the forestry sector, had a hard time tracking customers and sales. And so we looked at what was the primary problem while replacing a system that no longer meets the needs: visibility into operations and sales. What were their perceived barriers that they had for wanting to put a system in? Well, the perceived barriers that they looked at were lack of trust and relationship, confusion, cost, and lack of resources. Cost was really a big thing. And you always hear this. The cost comes up all the time in the conversation around what a buyer cares about. Cost is always an issue, even when you're selling a really expensive solution. You're always going to have to show cost versus value. And then their decision criteria is they wanted the best value compared to what they were trying to do, best approach, and they wanted to ensure that the person could deliver. And their buyer journey was they did a web search, they went to LinkedIn to ask for referrals, they got referrals via word of mouth. And the other thing that was really interesting, we did this project, is we had sort of an aha moment when we discovered that these companies were going to government agencies to look for funding. So this is how you would put together a buyer persona: the priority of the person, the success factor that they're hoping to achieve, the perceived barriers that are causing or stopping them from doing anything, the decision criteria that they're going to go through, and then the buyer journey that they're going to take to select or shortlist someone. Now, when you see these topics laid out in this way, you can start to see how your content needs to build behind it in order to assist somebody in a self-serve way on a website, maybe in a post you did on LinkedIn, that you're tying it back all the time to the buyer persona. And you can understand then, when we looked at the original persona for Judy, you can understand that how do we tie content to somebody who we just have demographics about? We need to hit them on the issues that they care about. And one could argue, well, if we put out ski content, Judy loves to ski. If we put out ski content, maybe we'd catch her attention. Well, if you're selling skis, that's probably a good idea. But if you're selling IT services to somebody, what has skiing got to do with IT services? And how are you ever going to get them on board? Because they're not going to trust you that you know what you're doing when it comes to IT services. So I just use that as an extreme example. If we go back to the homepage for our friends at Lloyd Business IT Solutions, I just want to show you a couple of salient points here where we used the buyer persona to develop content on the homepage and conversion points on the homepage. So, trusted Microsoft partner for Northern Ontario, they'd never had that positioning statement under their name before of the what is it? And this was really important because everybody they were selling to was buying Microsoft and they were geographically positioned. So it was really important that we said right away, we're a Microsoft partner in Northern Ontario. The second thing we knew in the buyer journey was that people were looking for case studies and they wanted to see similar people who had done similar things and understand how that worked for them. So we knew to put case studies in the main navigation right up at the top. But the other one that was an aha moment when we did the buyer persona is that a lot of leads were coming through government agencies of people looking for funding. So what an idea. Let's put funding up on this homepage to help people understand how to get funding in Northern Ontario. And you can see that in number 4, we created a guide, the guide to funding options, because this company actually helps people look at all their funding options because they've been doing this for 30 years. They know where all the funders are. What a great hook. What a great hook to the buyer persona if that is the issue around cost. And then the 5th thing we did is really position what the rest of the content was going to be on this website. Do you need help with software to grow your business and funding to get you there? get the guide to funding options. So this is how we use the buyer persona and what we know about the buyer persona and apply it to content and a customer journey on a website in order to get a name on an email list that we can start to nurture and get to know over time, so that we can start to understand if that name on an email list who put in their email address because they wanted that was a really useful piece of content, a guide to funding options, we can now start to figure out over time if they're a sales qualified lead. This is how you prove to your management team that there's a direct correlation between buyer personas and buyer persona mapping and revenue. And then of course, we're going to talk a little bit about how important it is to have a system behind that and the system helping with that. Now, I'm going to stop for a second and put up our second poll question. I think Krista, I apologize. I think I might've been a slide too late on it, but if we could put up poll question number 2, what is the primary objective of your website?
I love interaction from the audience. This is great. Well, it looks like lead generation is winning.
Okay. All right. I love this. I love this. And I love this for a lot of reasons. Oftentimes when we go in and work with management teams and I ask this question, what is the primary objective of your website? The CEO often says, well, it's all 4 of those things. And I have to say to them, it can't be all 4 of those things. Because if it's all 4 of those things, what you lead off with is 4 different things and you confuse your buyer. Thanks so much for everybody for putting that in there. I think we're going to end the poll. Let me see if I can get back to the page here. Okay, thanks so much. So the reason it can't be all things is if it's brand awareness, all you're wanting to do is describe your business. And there would be no calls to action. There'd be no, things to put there. If it's lead generation, you're trying to get new names on a list. So there better be really compelling offers on your website in order to do that. If it's lead nurturing, the website's going to play less of a role because you've got that initial person and now you're going to start to nurture them over time with really good content. And if it's thought leadership, we'd be putting up a site right now all about, in this particular case, all about cybersecurity and the most active ways to do cybersecurity today. So you can see how each of those objectives carry a different strategy. And when you try to deploy them all at once, it's not going to work. So I often get people to really work with their management teams and ask right off the bat, what do we care about the most? Building a list, nurturing a list, or putting our stake in the sand with respect to where we stand on certain issues and topics. Sometimes you can deploy multiple strategies by using various approaches to the website. But if it truly is lead generation, you better have a really compelling offer. Otherwise, you're not going to put names on a list. So that's why I really like to ask that question and have people think about it, because you might be up against some situations in your own organization where there's competing ideas and competing agreement on what the primary objective is. And so that's problematic. It's problematic for marketers in particular and salespeople in particular, because everybody has to be on the same page. So I always ask that question because I think it's really helpful to get a level set on that. Just hold on for 1 second. Here we go. One of the things I always say, and this isn't meant to be a criticism, but a lot of times marketers guess. They guess about tactics. They guess about things they should be doing. Let's try this now and see if it works. Hey, let's do a webinar and see if it works. Webinars probably will work, and blogging probably will work, and doing maybe some digital advertising probably will work. But instead of guessing, why don't you get certain about content, the buyer persona and the buyer journey, and then make sure your tactics are mapped to that. So I think that's really important. Here's how we use a buyer persona today. There's going to be content that you think is important. And again, there's never been a company I've worked with that hasn't led with the idea of here's what we do, as opposed to why it matters. So you're probably pushing out a lot of product information, maybe services information. So there's things that you think is important as a company. And then there's what your buyer thinks is important. And somewhere in that intersection is where your content strategy is going to land. And it has to land on emotional triggers. And the difference between emotional triggers and intellectual triggers, I can tell you that What's a great example? I can tell you that getting vaccinated is a good thing to do. And I can have a whole intellectual conversation, but you at an emotional level is going to feel one way or the other about that. After we've all lived through that in the last 18 months, there's going to be an emotional trigger. And so you need to lead with the emotional trigger. And that's the same in business. And particularly with consumers, we know that a lot of consumer marketing is very much emotionally driven. I don't need this product, but I really like it. And it speaks to me as a person and what I'm trying to accomplish in my own life. So it's what you think is important, what buyers think is important, and right in the middle is a content strategy that needs to have emotional triggers to bring people into that conversation. So the benefits of using buyer personas is that it really helps you think about buyers as real people and not demographics. You can really get into the head of a buyer specifically, even if it's only one and you build the persona around that one person who's your best customer, there's a chance there's more of those people out there that you can go look for. It creates a sense of connection when we're trying to establish trust and lack of a face-to-face world that we still find ourselves in. It uncovers useful triggers that can help us create compelling and more meaningful content, and it makes buyers more receptive. A couple of years ago, I was working with a company and they asked me to do an evaluation of their blogs and tell me whether I thought their content was useful. And so I used a lot of data to see what was getting read and what wasn't getting read. But I stumbled across a blog post about the company picnic. Now, I'm sure the blog post was on the site because they wanted to show people what a great company they were. But that type of content is completely useless in a buyer journey. It may or may not help people understand what type of company, but it's not helping me decide if I choose this over this, what's going to happen. If I engage in a buying exercise with you, what are the first steps? Do I need to do a demo first? Who do I need to get on side? It's okay to use that content occasionally, but this company's website was just full of that. And that's all it was. There was no content that said, you're going to have an issue transitioning from this system to this system. Therefore, here's the steps. And this is why you want to consider all these options before you choose a provider to help you with this. The company picnic isn't going to do that. So when we do a buyer persona map, it really shows us this information clearly so that we know what type. Most importantly, though, it can save your company thousands and even millions of dollars when you do the work to develop meaningful buyer personas so you know exactly what type of content. Now, our friends that I showed you, the case study I showed you, Lloyd Business Solutions, when they stumbled upon the idea that the buyer really needed to find funding and that there was a lot of money available in Northern Ontario for companies like the ones they were going after, it suddenly dawned on them that they could really double or triple the size of their list by anchoring their story to that message. And I have heard of other situations where when people did the buyer persona, they realized that all the money they were about to spend on campaigns was meaningless because it didn't speak to what the buyer cared about. So I think it saves us money. It helps make us money, but I think it also saves us money. We need to tie lead generation to a buyer persona because we don't know what a buyer is doing when they're making a buyer decision. They have many, many paths they're going down. And we've heard this stat before. They're 60 to 70% of the way through their buyer journey before we probably even hear from them, before they raise their hand. There's all this information that we're trying to rein in and harness, particularly with our marketing automation tools and the way we're trying to build programs. And what we know about them is actually so very, very small. When we use a buyer persona, we can start to map out stuff we may not understand about them and information we might not know about them. And hopefully we can trigger people to show up and be there when they're ready. So here's how you have to do the work. It will save you time because you can test better content. It will save you money because you'll focus on the right conversion strategy, and it will advance your business because you'll be able to generate better leads. A buyer persona, and where I've taken a lot of my learning, and I highly recommend all of you go and check out Adele Ravella at the Buyer Persona Institute. She's been doing research on this topic for 20 years. I'm going to show you her book in a second. It's an invaluable tool for marketers. But the 5 rings of buyer insight that you want to map in your buyer persona and then will help you map out the buyer journey is, what are the buyer's priority initiatives? And you're going to need to be rock solid on that. Some people may say, well, I don't know this. Oftentimes I sit with sales teams and sales calls to figure this out. When the sales team can't answer the question, I go ask the best customer directly. What was your priority or initiative for buying this product or service? What success factors is the buyer looking for? What's going to lead them to say this was successful? What I did worked. I was glad I spent the money on this. What are their perceived barriers? And this is the ring of insight that I love, 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 love the most. I go back to either the sales team or to buyers and say, why did you not choose this company? And I know sometimes that's hard to do, but oftentimes the sales team has a very clear idea of why they lost a deal. Why did you not buy something? And I'll hear things like, it seemed too complicated. I didn't like the process we were going to have to go through to implement this solution. It seemed like it cost too much. And so when I see these perceived barriers, I turn those into positives on somebody's website. I explain very clearly what the process is going to be to buy something so they can see that content in a self-serve way. I explain what the process is the company will go through and what you can plan to expect after you've bought the product or service. And the last one is pricing. And I tell everyone, you need to have pricing on your website, because whether you like it or not, it's the third or fourth most asked question by a buyer as they're checking something else. Can I afford it? How much is it going to cost? So if you're losing deals because it's perceived to be too expensive, wouldn't it be great to be able to qualify people in or out of the sales process before they waste all your salespeople's time, because you've been really clear and very focused on what somebody should budget for your project or product or service, or at least have an understanding of cost. So I love the perceived barriers category because it helps me be really rock solid as a marketer about what type of content should be included. Their decision criteria and how they make a decision is important, because that's where those influencers and those researchers come in, so that now you can start building secondary and tertiary personas, because they need content too. And then knowing where a buyer is going, doing what they're thinking, how they're looking, just makes you so much better at applying that to your website or to all of your digital online tactics. Again, I think this is a great book. I've bought it for everybody I know. I've read it a couple of times now, but this book by Adele Ravella is fantastic. And if you want to start to think about focusing your efforts, I wrote this book 4 years ago, You Can't Be Everywhere, and it's all about bringing your buyers into the conversation and how you get them on board. So those are two great resources that I highly encourage you to check out if you're struggling. I'm just checking to see if we have another poll question, and I think we do. So Krista, if I can ask you to put up poll question number 3, because I think this is really important as we're starting to fill in this worksheet. Who is responsible for identifying your target economic buyer? Just help us understand where you're getting your guidance from on that.
This doesn't look surprising to me, does it to you, Marie?
No, not at all. So I really love that there's a good group of people who are in sales saying this. I think it's really important to know who you're getting agreement from on your target economic buyer. And so that's why we put this up, because it's just another food for thought as you go through this exercise. So thanks everyone for doing that poll. I really appreciate it. I'm going to close out of the poll now, if that's all right.
Yep.
And we'll get back to the worksheet here. So what you want to do is you want to set up your worksheet with priority, initiative, success factor, perceived barrier, decision criteria, and buyer journey. And then you would put, who triggered the search and why, what's the significant event, what's different now that creates this opportunity now, what makes it urgent, what makes it. And so that's where you're starting to fill this information in, because you're going to find a whole bunch of beautiful little things in there. I'm working with a company right now that's in the AI space, and you can imagine selling AI right now is really tricky. It was a little bit like selling cloud services about 6 or 7 years ago, and a little bit like selling software as a service about 10 or 15 years ago, because people didn't quite understand what it was and why they wanted it. And so instead of just saying, well, this is the next best thing and you need it, which isn't a very compelling value proposition, it's really important to say, what is creating the opportunity right now? What makes this a must-have versus a nice-to-have? And one of the things we uncovered with this company is that, there's education that has to go on in the market about building versus buying. this product or service? Should we build it or do it ourselves, try to do it ourselves, or should we get somebody else to bring it in? So that creates really compelling content and a great opportunity for a conversion tool. What does the world look like after they've made a change? What's the most important goals they hope to achieve? Case studies are really useful here. And if, for example, you can't name your customers and do case studies, I highly recommend doing use cases. So you create a fictitious company and you explain in really clear detail how that works. So if somebody needs success factors, there's content we need there. What's perceived barriers? Sorry, we've got a typo there. It should be what will stop them from doing something, not hat will stop them. Why should they choose you? Decision criteria, how will they evaluate? How will they make a decision? So I always sit with sales teams and go through the answers to all these questions. And I try to dig in as much as I can. And when I find we don't know the answer to certain questions, I bring that forward and say, how are we going to find this out? Because we can't go spending time and money on content and the website and other good things if we don't know this, because it just sets us up to fail as marketers. So this is really what your buyer persona worksheet is going to look like. Hold on for 1 second. There we go. The other worksheet that I really like marketers to be using, or when we put our marketing strategy or even our sales strategy together, we always want to talk about what our sales model is. Is it inbound lead generation, outbound business development, direct selling? It could be a whole bunch of things. And then we want to know awareness, consideration, and qualified for sales. Okay, the one thing that I find all the time when I go in to do a marketing automation project is I ask the question, what's your definition of a lead? And I get about 50 different answers. And, just because somebody downloaded something on your website or contacted you through the website or met you at a trade show doesn't mean they're a sales qualified lead. It means they're curious and you've built awareness. Now you have to do things to understand if they're ready to consider, and then you have to do things to understand whether they're qualified for sales. So this is where you need to start mapping out, once you know the details around your economic buyer, what's the emotional trigger that you're going to use to inspire someone to start being aware of you? What's unique and different that you can use to build trust, and how are we discussing success factors? So we use this map as well. And you can see as you move across the map that we're getting to the understanding of what a marketing qualified lead is, so that we can now say it's worth the sales team's time to start working this lead. And this applies in the B2C space, particularly with high consideration products. Remember, I said buyer personas work best when it's a high consideration product. And so there's all these steps that the buyer is going through, and that's where you want to map this out, because it makes it so much easier to do two things. Get the sales team on side with what you're doing is lead generation and being able to map it correctly into your technology. The first one I love because I've been in sales and marketing for over 30 years, and I've never met a sales team who didn't say, oh, the marketing team doesn't generate good leads for us. And the marketing team says, we generate all these leads and the sales team doesn't do anything with them. That stops all of that, this conversation, and aligns the sales and marketing team on what's a marketing qualified lead and what's a sales qualified lead. So this is where the buyer persona becomes just invaluable. If you're struggling with some of the answers to these questions, the best thing you can do is speak with a new customer and ask them, take me back to the moment when you started to think about your problem. How did you think about it? And how did you express that problem? And what did you do first to try to fix it? Because you're going to learn a lot. And I know sometimes it's hard to dig out and find customers to talk to you about these things, but believe me, there's lots of nice people out there in the world who are willing to spend some time with you if they think it's going to improve their sales process in the future. So I highly recommend you do that. The next thing that is another hint for people is that buyers don't care about features or benefits. In a sea of choice, everyone looks exactly the same. So you need to find an emotional trigger that can connect them to their problem. And this is done by building a buyer persona. In the past, we might have seen what we call the traditional sales funnel looking like this. And I call it, I'm not very gracious about this. I call it the spray and pray model. There was a lot of times, and I was guilty of it back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that it was just about volume. Let's spend a lot of money at a trade show and see as many people as we can. Let's buy some lists and, get it out there. Let's get some Google ads going. Let's do some PR. And we were just hoping that if we hit as many eyeballs as possible, It would bring people to us, and we might get that name, which then we would start chasing. And are you ready to buy? Are you ready to buy? Are you ready to buy? Are you ready to buy now? And nobody likes that. It's not the way buyers buy. And it's an old, broken, outdated model. And what would be happening in this model is that we would have campaigns that would drive visitors, and we'd have passive interest. People would start chasing. We may or may not convert that. And then we may or may not get closed deals. This is exactly why the sales team would say, marketing isn't generating good leads for me. They don't generate good leads. I need better leads. Your conversion was probably pretty low in this model, and it was at a tremendously high cost of sales. So in the new world, I don't think the funnel's a funnel anymore. I think it's a pyramid. And the pyramid is about all the things we can be doing online. And, we definitely are leaning towards the online. To establish our unique value proposition in the market, share value-added content, qualify those leads with marketing and automation and good content, start a dialogue because we've built trust, because we've given something of value, and then we can start to understand where they are so we can pass them to sales. So we need to flip the funnel. I call this flipping the funnel. And what this does is that it pushes the responsibility back to the marketing team around visitors, engagement, and qualification, so that sales is just focusing on conversion and closed deals. And it's there where content created using a buyer persona makes better engagement, and quite frankly, makes the marketing team rock stars for the sales team and the management team, because they're doing the heavy lifting and hard work to figure out where this person's at in the buyer journey. But we can't do that without a buyer persona well documented. So I think this is where the world's going. It's going to create a lower cost of sales, and it's going to help us really align sales and marketing. So let's go to our next poll question right now. If we could, poll question number 4. And poll question number 4 is, do you have your sales process mapped in your CRM today?
I like the honesty that comes out in these poll questions as well.
I do too. I do too. All right. I'm seeing more yeses than I thought I was going to see. So well done, everybody on the session today. Maybe that's why I have a job, and that's maybe why I get called, but I rarely hear yes to this question. So well done to the 32% on the session today. For the 44% who've said no, it's okay. This is your first step. You're
not alone.
This problem, and you're not alone. And for those who are unsure, I would get back right in with your team right now and start asking some of these tough questions, because these are the things that are going to uncover the best marketing strategy and the best content strategy for you. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. I'm just going to close it, and then we're going to get back down here. Now, this is an overwhelming page, and my first rule I teach business presentation and public speaking at the University of Toronto. My first rule is don't put a lot of words on a slide. So I broke my own rule here, but I just want to show you what your one-page map is going to look like. Okay. You're going to take your buyer persona after you've done those 5 rings of insight, and you're going to clearly identify what their objective is. What are they trying to do in the awareness when they think about their problem? What are they trying to do in the awareness category? And I'm using an example here in case you're wondering why there's some strange language on this map. I'm using the example of a fictitious event management company in this map just to explain this. So if you sell event management services, let's just say you sold them on scale, and you're having awards, galas, programs, and you're doing all of the project management and equipment and everything else to pull this off. As you're getting aware as an event manager, and that's clearly who this persona is tied to, if you're getting aware as an event manager, what my main objective is, how do I pull off this event and make it a big success? That's what I'm thinking in my head. And then my requirements, how do I confirm my event goals? What are the choices that I need to achieving an audience connection to get my event to go really well? Who meets my requirements? What's the company's price, solution, and support? How did my event go? And did I achieve my audience connection? And then there's going to be key activities that are going to bring me in. And then there's going to be information consumed as I'm going through that. And then there's going to be information used. And then we know we would move them to the next phase in the bottom quadrant when these things start to happen. So this is an example I wanted to show you. As I say, this is overwhelming, and oftentimes it needs, a team of people to sit down and work this out. But this is definitely where you're now starting to figure out, how can I go from just identifying a name on a list to bringing them over to a sales qualified lead, and what steps are they going to go through? So that's why I pull this up and show it. And I think it's a good chart to use just to understand how you're going to map all that. So we've created a worksheet for you, and this will be available in the download that we're going to offer you at the end of the masterclass. And this is where, you can start to fill in some of this information, and this information will get pulled directly from your buyer persona. And in doing so, when you pull it from your buyer persona information, you're now going to see what kind of content do I need to develop, where do I need to put it, and what's the trigger that takes them from one step to the next. So I think that's really important. We pulled some data for you of closed won versus closed lost opportunity ratios, and what's really helping people drive their lead gen. And events and lead lists are really low at this point, even though it looks like they're at the top here, but it's really low. And what's really working well is social media and referrals and your website. So this is why you need to start mapping this into your website, into your digital tactics, and using this stuff more online. Events, lead lists, partners are likely going to be closed lost. But when you're starting to use your website, your social media, your referrals on social, all those types of things, you're starting to see more closed won opportunities. Okay, so we said there'd be a free gift with purchase. And I know you didn't purchase anything today, but we're still going to give you a free gift. We have a buyer persona workbook that's available on that link above. And after the session today, we're going to email out this link to everybody so that you're going to get it. And you can go and get the buyer persona workbook that we've developed. So you've got all the information in one spot, and you can take it forward to your sales team or your management team, and you can start working on your buyer personas. The other thing we have for you today is Marketing CoPilot does a web presence health check and digital readiness score. We have a special offer for people on the phone today, but what we do with the web presence health check is it's an actual human being. We're not using a tool to do this. We go in and look at your website, the content on your website, the ability for that website to convert. We look at your Google Analytics, and then we benchmark you against 2 or 3 of your competitors. And that allows us to give you a digital readiness score. Not to say you're doing a bad job, but it shows you if you're sort of a digital starter and you want to move to more intermediate, what's the gaps between where you are today and where you need to be. And I would say that this is a fantastic product to start with if you're trying to get your management team on side with making some changes in your digital marketing program, and probably getting started with some more aggressive mapping of lead gen. So I think this is something that we've got information about on our website right now. You can go read more details. We normally charge $17.50 for this, but for people on today, we have a value added price. But we've done this with many companies, and they just find it invaluable because it just helps them understand where they are today, where they need to be, and what they should focus on, so that they're not all over the place trying to do a million things at once. So, if this is an issue for you, would love for you to reach out. But let's do our very last poll question today, Krista, if you don't mind. Put up poll question number 5, because if your numbers are low on the answer to this question, this is something you might want to consider, and definitely doing your buyer persona. So last poll question number 5 is, drum roll, please.
It seems to have frozen. Hold on.
We're holding everybody in suspense. Everybody can't wait to hear the last poll question. So I'm going to, there we go. Thank you. How many leads, interactions are you generating from your website monthly? And that can be somebody filled out a form, somebody downloaded something.
Somebody asked you a question, maybe.
Exactly.
Like, hey, I want to learn more.
Not spam, not bot stuff, but
right.
What are you generating? Okay, we got a lot of people in the number 1 category, which is less than 25. People who are unsure, I highly, highly recommend you do a web presence health check. If you don't know what you're generating through digital interaction today, that would be a very useful thing for you to know. And we can tell that through Google Analytics and a number of other things. But most people are falling into the less than 25 category. So, again, I think if the reason that is because you don't have the right content, you're not getting the right support from your management team, you're not, getting support for the activities, then a web presence health check and a digital readiness score really paints the picture and just lays it out. So that's why we asked this poll question, but also, this is really where you start to understand the importance of marketing automation, the importance of having the right CRM, the right content. Because if you don't know, it likely means the data is not going into your CRM correctly and you're not tracking and measuring it. You definitely want to do that because that's how you'll know whether your marketing is making you money or losing you money. And there's only, 2 things that your CFO or your head financial guy cares about. Are we making money or are we losing money? And you can tie it right back to those things.
Awesome. Thank you, Marie. Appreciate all of this wonderful information that you shared. And there was a question in the chat, a couple of questions that came up in the chat. And one of them was, talk to us a little bit more about that, the primary purpose of the Lloyd website example that you shared earlier in the presentation.
Great question. Thank you for asking. The primary objective was generating email addresses. We didn't have a good list. Right. We wanted to generate email addresses. So we took that Get Your Funding page and we did some sponsored content. We did blog posts against it. We had a very small list to start with, and we wanted to double the size of the list because we knew there was lots of people in the community who could use the services, but we didn't necessarily have identified who they were. So their primary objective was what we would call lead generation.
Awesome. And then another one, when you were talking about those final decision makers, what if that final decision maker isn't a person, but rather a committee?
Oh, great question. Okay. Though that's a really complex sale. And when I say high consideration sale, it's very high consideration. If we know that it's a committee, what we need to do is identify the members of the committee, and the committee itself will have a success factor and a priority objective. And we need to know what the priority objective is. In my life in sales, this is often a question that salespeople don't ask well, or they forget to ask because they're so interested in jumping in and offering the solution or the answer to what they could do. They forget to ask the question, why do you want to do this? That's the most important question you can ask in sales. Why do you want to do this? So if a committee is working together on purchasing something, this oftentimes happens in government, procurement, all those types of things. You have to get a lot of clarity around why is their committee and why do they want to do this? And when you get that primary objective, even though it's a group of people, if they haven't rallied behind the primary objective, then you're always going to have a difficult time selling to them. Mm-hmm. So you really want to dig in and find out if it's a committee, what's the primary objective of the committee? What are they trying to accomplish? Why do they want to do it? And then you can start to break down the personas within the committee and what they care about. There's oftentimes a finance person on the committee. There's oftentimes a subject matter expert on the committee. So it makes for a more complicated buyer persona map, but you still create it with the committee at the top. And then the individuals within the committee are personas that you have to speak to within that committee.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Those were all the questions that I saw in the chat, but I know there are still quite a few people online on the call. So if anybody else has a question for Marie before we disperse and finish out the second half of our days, except for the person in Germany who is probably finished with their day by now. Oh, there's a hand raised. I am going to allow you to talk. So let's see if this works.
Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hello.
You can.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the presentation. Very valuable information, very informative. I just had a couple of questions. first one I had was, you spoke in terms of the various economic buyers when you looked at the IT specialists and also what their different priorities were um, in terms of their needs for a solution. How do you either pull those priorities together, or do you handle them separately in terms of looking at a buyer persona map?
So if all three of those people were buyers of your solution, is that what you're asking?
Well, they have different priorities. I think
Right.
one of the first slides you showed was looking at a CIO and also just, an IT person, an IT tech, and can't remember offhand what the other person was looking at, but they
Right.
had different priorities. So how would you create, a buyer persona around all three of those priorities, or would they be handled separately?
They all have to be handled separately. And they all have to be handled separately, because just imagine, let's use a consumer example. Let's imagine that I'm just learning how to ski. And if I'm just learning how to ski, I'm going to need a certain type of ski boot and skis and poles. And so I'm not going to be advanced, and I'm probably not going to want to spend a lot of money until I know whether I like it. And I have very different objectives as a beginner skier versus an intermediate skier versus an expert skier. And that's basically what we were laying out there in that slide. You've got the IT manager who's trying to do it all, who's kind of at the beginner stage of understanding how to purchase something, might want to outsource everything. And then the person in the middle, who's the director of IT, is starting to get a handle for it, but needs help with strategy. And then the CIO needs help with a bunch of other things. In that situation, you would have to have a central value proposition for your company about why all three of them should care. But then you have to have very specific buyer journeys for each one of them, because their journeys are going to be different. And that's what I was saying, that, if you went out with what's the latest and greatest in cybersecurity practices to try to target the IT manager, that might be a value to him, but it's certainly not a value to the CIO, who's got a very robust, deep dive on a cybersecurity program. He's going to have a whole bunch of other things that are going to appeal to him. So those are three different personas. Those are three different strategies you're going to have to deploy. But if your company is selling to all three of them, you have to have a central value proposition that makes sense to all three of them. And then each of them needs very different content.
So similar to that phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 slide that you showed, Marie.
Yeah.
And I just have one more question, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Just for clarification. You spoke in terms of the marketer focusing on visitor engagement and qualification. And I missed what you said in terms of the sales team, what their focus should be once, most everything is ironed out. Once, the marketers are able to focus on visitor engagement and qualification.
Well, at that point now, there should be trust built up between the prospect and the company. And that's definitely the responsibility of the marketers, to build trust with good content and valuable content that they lead them through a process. Once we think that there's been trust established, then I think it's important for a salesperson to reach out and start building a relationship. But what has been happening in the past is that in the infancy of digital marketing, let's just say, for example, we put an offer out, we had 100 people download a piece of content. And within 10 minutes, that person's phone was ringing with a salesperson saying, "Hey, I noticed you downloaded our guide. Are you ready to buy something?" Well, they're not. They're not. And that really puts people off. So it's marketing's job to warm up that relationship. And oftentimes what we do is we apply workflows when a piece of content or something's been downloaded and we've identified an email address, and we put people into a very gentle workflow. That's what the importance of a tool like Influence is all about. That's why we use marketing automation. And we put people in that workflow and we start to gauge their interest level of opening content, reading emails. And if they don't, we move them into another bucket. And when we think that the engagement level with online content is at a certain height, then we would pass it over to sales to gently open the door and say, "Hey, I understand that this particular issue has been a big problem for your organization. Is this something that you're thinking about fixing this year? And if so, is there a way we could have a conversation about that? And it might take 3 or 4 touches from the sales team before they'll see whether somebody's ready to respond. But the role of marketing should be building trust, awareness and trust. And the role of sales should be to take that trust and not damage it in any way, but move them along to see whether it's ready to engage them in a sales conversation. Does that help you?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, it does very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. They're great. Do we have any more questions, Monica?
That's it. That's
Okay.
all we've got for now. So thank you, Marie. Thank you for everyone who attended. We appreciate your time. And got lots of thanks in the chat as well. So everyone have a great rest of your day, and feel free to reach out to Marie or Influence with any other questions that you have after you log off. Great to see everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being here, everyone.